Kia ora. For those of you who watch BHN, you'll know I'm in Australia right now. This episode of Locked Out was recorded on Saturday before I left to come here to Australia. Since then, the Minister of Finance has made some changes that affected one of the slides on this show, specifically this one. The Minister of Finance has reduced the operating allowance, which is all the money that the Minister has to spend on new things, from $2.4 billion to $1.3 billion. That makes all of the difficulties highlighted on this chart even more difficult to manage. It just goes to show how difficult it is to keep up with the current cuts programme of this government. We hope you enjoy the rest of the show.
Kia ora koutou, a warm welcome to Locked Out with Craig Rennie. By day, I'm the Economist and Director of Policy for the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions. But by night, this podcast looks at the numbers in New Zealand and asks the hard questions so that you can too. Here at Locked Out, we're always interested in what our viewers and listeners want to know and what numbers are making them say, is that right? You can be in no doubt if you're thinking it, we are too. So get in touch. I'm on X, Blue Sky and Substack. We want to hear how we can better help you understand the numbers and what's really going on, so you can navigate what's being thrown around by politicians and experts alike. This is a pre-recorded show, as I'm currently in Australia for work and can't be with you all. As a consequence, it'll be shorter than the previous two episodes, but some of you might be happy about that, so I'll leave that there. If anything huge has happened in the period between Saturday, when this is being recorded, and when this is being released on Thursday the 1st of May, apologies. I'll make it up to you all next week when we talk about housing with some very special guests on May the 8th. I want to talk to you all today about the budget. We're just 4 weeks away from the big day, and I thought we might share some views and some thoughts about what's likely to happen and what the current government's currently thinking. The government's been making some spending announcements recently that should be influencing what's in the documents on May 22nd. We've also had a number of external events that have made writing a budget even more difficult than usual, including Donald Trump and his new tariff regime. But the best thing you can probably take away right now is that it's all a bit late. The budget will very likely have been written, agreed by Cabinet, and will be off to the printers. Decisions taken from here will affect the next budget in 2026. So let's delve into what we know and what's going to be in front of us. Hello, this is our Budget 2025 analysis, and it's based upon two recent updates. The first one of which is the Reserve Bank's monetary policy statement from February 2025 and contains all of the Reserve Bank's forecasts for things like GDP or unemployment. The second one of which is the half-year economic and fiscal update, which some people suggest that the Minister of Finance had me locked out of. I certainly couldn't attend the update. When we look at what those forecasts are telling us, we can see what the problem is that the government's trying to wrestle with at Budget 2025. If we draw a line which contains all of the GDP figures since 2009, we can see that that line goes from about $45 billion in 2009 up to about $70 billion in 2024. And we can draw a line through that, which is trend growth. It rises about 2.8% a year, and we can forecast that into the future. If we look at what the Reserve Bank then tells us for where growth is going to be, which is the orange line on the screen here, it never gets back to that trend line of growth. We have a constant gap between those two. The gap between those two across the forecast period is $37.5 billion of essentially lost economic output. That's the challenge that the Treasury is dealing with. We have a smaller economy than we did pre the recession that we had earlier in 2024. And what's driving that? What's causing that smaller economy? Well, in part, it's business investment. Business investment, according to the Reserve Bank, back in November, was rising across the forecast period from about $10.5 billion just shy of $12 billion. Now, it's forecast to be $8.5 billion less across the forecast period at the February update, and it's smaller every year. We then see residential investment. So this is investment in new homes, And we see, again, the Reserve Bank forecast that it would rise from $3.8 billion to just shy of $4.6 billion by 2027. Again, it's smaller every year, and there's $5 billion less residential investment across the period from 2024 through to 2027. That's about 5,000 fewer houses being built across that forecast period. And when we look at employment, something that's very close to my heart, we can draw that back to 2010, and we can see a gently rising slope between 2010 and again 2023, where the number of people in employment rose pretty much consistently year after year. But from the end of 2023 through to the end of the forecast period of 2027, we can see essentially no economic employment growth, essentially year after year of the labour market remaining stable. And we haven't seen that sort of trough in New Zealand in 10, 20 years. So what does all of this mean for budget 2025? Well, Treasury's sort of slightly given the game away at the half-year economic and fiscal update. It's produced this piece of analysis, which is called the operating allowances. And as you can see from figure 3 on the screen, in the next 4 years, we have forecast operating allowances of $2.4 billion in each year. Those are smaller operating allowances than we had in 2005, 2006, which means we're spending less new money, we're having less investment in New Zealand than we were under Helen Clark. And the key line from this section is, second, savings will need to be found beyond those already identified in the previous budget. So what this is Treasury code for is more cuts being expected in budget 2025, and cuts year after year after year. Government departments should expect to receive no additional funding in the budget. So that's cuts in real terms for pretty much the majority of every government department. And so when we look at that operating allowance of $2.4 billion, which is quite a lot of money, but when we take it apart, it's even less money, because $1.4 billion of that goes to health. It's already been pre-committed. It's already in the books. Other pre-commitments, including spending on Pharmac, reduce that by a further $300 million, which means there's only $700 million left. Only we haven't set aside anything for education. And normally education, just to keep the lights on, because we have more children, means that we need to be spending around $600 million on education every year. So removing that means that we have just $100 million in new spending at this budget. Only defence has been promised more money, and we'll talk about that in a second. There's no money for police to reach their targets. There's no money for the Regional Growth Fund. There's no money for the Going for Growth activities that were promised under this government. Funding will only come from cuts, because there is nowhere else for the funding to come from. Now, the government also, in the budget policy statement, put out this statement: the government will continue to invest heavily in infrastructure, including record investment in budget 2024 across a range of sectors. But if we look at the chart produced in the budget policy statement, we can see that funding falls every year in terms of net purchases of physical assets by the Crown. In 2024, we were purchasing around $18 billion of assets, and by 2028, we're purchasing $10 billion of physical assets. So real investment in new things is actually falling year after year. And do you know what's not in those numbers? Any boats. There are no IREX ferries in those boats. So these have to come from money that's already inside those budgets. So quite where the new money for the ferries is going to come from is anyone's guess. But again, it will be another expense that the Crown has to find in already very constrained books. So the question I've got for you right now is, how do you think this is going? Because to me, if I was writing this budget, I would be saying there's not enough space, we need to do something different, the economy is slowing down, let's change track. Unfortunately, that's not the path the government's chosen. It's chosen to talk about investments in health. And it said we were going to invest a record $16 billion in health for the last budget. Only That's investment over 6 years, not over 1 year, as is often claimed. And if we look at the diagram here, we can see that investments, that $16 billion has to stretch from 2024, 2025, all the way through to 2029, 2030. So one of the things you should really think about is that every time we invest an extra dollar, that's a record in health. So at this budget, you'll hear the government say again, there's going to be record investment in health. Anytime we spend an extra dollar, that's a record investment in health. So don't fall for that cheap trick. And when we look at what happened in health funding last time round, we can see on a nominal basis, operating spending, which is spending on the day-to-day activities of health, we can see that didn't go up by $16.6 billion. Last year, the health funding went up by actually only $93 million, or 0.35%. But that's in nominal terms. Once we adjust for inflation, operational spending for health actually fell by $774 million. But wait, because I'm an economist, we can always make this worse. So when you take health operational expenditure per capita and break it down per person, essentially, we found that in nominal terms, health spending fell $63 per person because population was growing really quickly last year. When we take away the effects of inflation, health spending per person on an operational basis fell by $223 last year. That's a fall of 4.5% and helps to explain why health services are under quite so much pressure right now. And let's not forget, during the election campaign, various promises were made. We were promised cancer drugs that aren't in this budget, but will be in this one. Bowel screening was supposed to be for everyone from 45. Instead, we've taken bowel screening away from Māori and Pacifica groups, and we've reduced it only for a small number of people in New Zealand, rather than reducing it to 45. We were promised increased medicines funding, which hasn't turned up. We were promised mental health specialists across Aotearoa that, again, aren't there yet. We were promised 50 more doctors last year. We got 25 rather than 50. And here's a number to make you all think. We're spending $20 million on those 25 new doctors over the next 4 years, and that's good investment. That's good spending. But we're spending $30 million over the next 4 years on new security guards in A&E departments. I'll put it to you, we would need fewer security guards in A&E departments if we had more doctors and nurses inside A&E departments and people were actually being seen. The PM promised that we have pay parity for nurses regardless of where they work, and we certainly don't have that right now. And that he promised to pay nurses and midwives student loan repayments up to $4,500 a year. And again, that's still missing as a promise. There are also real problems in front of us, rather than just the election promises. New Zealand needs 4,800 nurses today, according to Tufata Ora. Yet, we also need to train a further 1,000 nurses a year just to stand still, never mind closing that particular gap. And that's of course, assuming that nobody leaves for a job overseas. And nurses are being paid better in Australia, in the UK, in the US, and Canada. In fact, in pretty much every developed country, nurses are paid better than in New Zealand. We need to double the number of Māori and Pacifica nurses if we want a workforce that looks like the rest of Aotearoa. And instead, what we've seen is the closing of the programs to help introduce more Māori and Pacifica nurses in New Zealand. And instead, we've got hiring freezes of nurses. And we need to make sure the value of any pay equity deals that have already been locked in are agreed. And we don't have that. That's not something the Ministry of Health has currently agreed to. So the question I've got for you right now is, knowing that in health, do you feel back on track yet? And now, at Budget 25, the government has a choice ahead of it. Vote Health was provided with $29.6 billion last year, of which $26 billion was health activity. That's not the ministry, that's not buildings, that's actual spending on real health activity. If we account for inflation, which is currently, which was at the time 2.2%, then we need to spend a particular amount of money. But health inflation is actually increasing at 6.15%. So to manage population and inflation pressures alone, we need to be spending $1.9 billion. Now, earlier, I said there was $1.4 billion set aside. So we're already, for health at this year, $500 million behind where we should be. And because of the way the public finance system works, you multiply that by 4 because that's the forecast period, which essentially works out at $2 billion less than should be being invested just to catch up with population and inflation pressures alone, just in health. And that means no new hospitals, staff, pay equity, managing demographic change because we have an increasingly elderly population who have more and greater needs in health. So if we also look at some of those recent announcements from the Minister of Health, on top of that, there were promises of up to 100 placements for overseas doctors. We were promised a new digital telehealth service, $285 million for GPs over 3 years, $95 million a year. $30 million was provided for practices to recruit new graduate nurses over 5 years. That's $6 million a year, or $1.14 per person in the country. And $50 million to help clear the elective surgery backlog, working with the private sector. But do you know what wasn't included in any of those announcements? There was no money. All of those announcements have to come from the existing amounts of money inside the health system. So all of those announcements act effectively as cuts to existing spending on health. And we have a health infrastructure plan where the government put forward redevelopment plans for health facilities. It's expected to cost $20 billion over the next 10 years, and there's no money inside that plan. They're just plans to do things. There's no financing to actually help deliver them. There is, the only developed plan inside the document is to develop the car parks of those hospitals rather than actually developing the hospitals themselves. Now, if we look at defence investment, because you may well have seen that the Defence Minister, Judith Collins, had a really big health announcement, a really big defence announcement. There's a huge new package announced for defence, and this is the Defence Capability Plan, which shows all of the defence spending. I'm sure you all have copies at home. There's about $12 billion over the next 4 years, which is about the same that New Zealand invests in terms of tertiary education. $9 billion of that is actual new spending. But again, the quick question is, where does the money come for this? Where is it going to be inside the budget? Because we can do some really quick calculations. Looking at the actual report, it plans to spend between 7.6 and $12.3 billion. Over the next 4 years, we've got approximately $1.3 billion in total in spare operational expenditure. Now that means we're only $7.7 billion short of the $9 billion needed. That means we'll be spending nothing on absolutely anything else. No new welfare, no transport, no housing, no police, no justice, no tackling child poverty, no action on climate change. I mean, there would be one saving grace. At least budget documents would be short because we would have spent every available cent on defence. And even then, we're $7.7 billion short. But Craig, some of that might be capital spending, right? I mean, some of it, we've got $14.5 billion of available capital spending over the period. But that means you won't be seeing any new roads, new hospitals, or perhaps a ferry or two for the next 4 years. So also in defence spending, capital spending has to be on capital items. Much of what's actually planned for the defence budget is actually operating spending. For example, software. We're planning on spending $1 billion on enterprise software for the Ministry of Defence. So being generous with the analysis, let's say that half the spending is capital spending. So if you spend all of the available OPEX and $4.5 billion as CAPEX, that means you're still short by $3 billion or $775 million a year. If only there was some recent tax announcement that cost $3 billion, say a landlord tax break that you could cancel, that could pay for this defence spending. That would be nice. That would be the fiscally responsible thing to do. But instead, it's going to come from borrowing or from more cuts. And importantly, defence spending has a distributional consequence. So who gets the benefits and who gets the losses? If there are cuts, they will come from public services that have already been decimated by the last budget. Additional cuts were already planned before this fresh round of spending on defence. And the users of public services tend to be poorer. The winners from this spending are largely overseas-based companies, Boeing, Airbus, British Aerospace Systems, who will be providing the material and the contracts. So essentially, the poor in New Zealand and poorer families in New Zealand will be paying the price for this defence spending round. We've also seen a range of other economic announcements from the Minister of Finance and elsewhere that are compounding the problems that are in front of us. It's been very clear for a while now that Donald Trump was going to have a range of new tariffs. Those new tariffs were announced at what we called his Liberation Day. We saw tariffs of 10% being announced on New Zealand. That's going to affect our ability to deliver exports. That affects our tax, which means we have less revenue for our spending. That means more borrowing. And if we don't want to deliver more borrowing, it means more cuts. The Minister of Finance said in a recent interview that operating allowances, which is the amount of new money that we have to spend on everything in a new budget, are a ceiling and not a target, suggesting that the government will be investing less than those advertised amounts. Bearing in mind, we only had $100 million available to us. The minister also said at the last budget, we delivered $23 billion of additional savings that we were able to reprioritize. That will be the same approach in this budget. So again, we're signaling more and deeper cuts at this budget. And that's what everything is telling us is likely to happen on May 22nd. So what kind of future does this suggest for New Zealand? What kind of thing does this budget likely tell us about where we're going to go? And to me, there's two scenarios that this budget will paint. And the first one of which is a kind of back to the future approach, where we go back to the economy we had in sort of 2015. We rely heavily on a few sectors like dairy and tourism, and unemployment is higher than it needs to be. Interest rates stay low, and we build an economy essentially selling houses to each other. It's a bit like Adele has been on the radio all the time. It's 2015, and it looks like it's an economy that is growing, but you're not seeing any benefit. Now, the second scenario is that essentially we go back-to-back inflation. Inflation continues to rise. It's already risen from 2.2% to 2.5% in this last quarter. As tariffs and global growth grinds down, unemployment doesn't stop at 5.2%, as the current forecasts suggest. We end up cutting further and further to balance the budget at the same time as demand in the economy falls. And so therefore, even the soggy growth forecast by the Reserve Bank in the last monetary policy statement fails to turn up because there's a lack of confidence. Workers feel insecure about their jobs, so they keep their hands in their pockets. They don't spend money. Businesses don't invest. New jobs aren't created. People therefore feel insecure about their jobs, and we go round and round and round, precisely because we don't invest in our future. So what does all of this mean? What does all of this mean for Budget 25? There's never been a more compelling case for change in economic policy than the data we have in New Zealand right now. And even if you don't believe in GDP, even if you're not a big fan of these key economic indicators, even if you don't think actually, we shouldn't be prioritizing economic growth at this point in time. The table on the chart on the screen in front of us now looks at child poverty. And it looks at the three indicators of child poverty. And what it does is it tells us how child poverty grew in the last year and how far away we are from the targets for child poverty. And this was the first time that all three of the targets, the key primary targets for child poverty, weren't met. There are now more than 156,000 children in New Zealand who are in material poverty. That means they don't have good shoes. They don't have a winter coat. They live in cold, damp housing. Their family regularly doesn't go to the doctor or the dentist because they can't afford to. Our indicators and our child poverty data are all heading in the wrong direction. We should be changing the approach we take at this budget. But we're not. And as a consequence, those numbers will likely continue to get worse. And to me, that's the biggest thing, that's the biggest condemnation I can make at this budget. The great economist Keynes said, "When the facts change, so do my opinions." Well, the facts have changed, and the minister and the government should change their fiscal approach. And at this budget, we should be investing in New Zealand rather than continuing to see cuts in investment and cuts year after year after year. So if you take nothing else away from this podcast today, please just take this. All of the spending decisions of this government are a choice. Nothing in the budget is natural. Everything in the budget is something you choose to do. Or every piece of investment, every piece of expenditure is something where the minister and the cabinet has to make a choice about what to do. And we can choose to do different things. We can choose to have a better set of outcomes. We just have to make those decisions. So because I like numbers, I want to leave you with one final number. There are 549 days until the next election. And if you're listening to this podcast, if you're watching this on screen, one thing you can take away from this is that we can't waste a single day in talking to the government, in talking to people and saying different choices would lead us to better outcomes and would lead us to a better situation in New Zealand, would lead to more employment, would lead to fewer children living in poverty. And we can't waste a single day in telling everyone that, because 549 days from now, we're going to make a really important decision about whether we continue on this trajectory or we choose to go somewhere else. Thanks so much for joining us here on Locked Out. We hope you found it in parts maddening and in parts enlightening. We look forward to seeing you all next week when we look at some illuminating new housing data we've generated here at Locked Out HQ. If you've enjoyed the show, please give us a review or a recommendation on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you download. Locked Out looks forward to talking with you all next week. Don't work too hard. Goodbye.